Hi, I'm Yaakov Katz, and welcome to another episode of the Jewish People's Podcast by JPPI. On today's episode, I'm joined by Dr. Gershon Baskin, one of Israel's most experienced negotiators and peace activists, and a man who, once again, found himself deeply involved in the delicate, high-stakes talks that led to the release of the last of the living hostages from Gaza. For most Israelis, the sight of these freed hostages stepping back into our country, it felt like the closing of a wound that had been open for too long, painful years. But for Baskin, it was not new terrain. More than a decade ago, almost 15 years ago, he played a decisive role in securing the release in 2011 of Gilad Shalit, the young IDF soldier held by Hamas after he was taken hostage for 5 years from 2006. This time, too, his connections and quiet diplomacy through indirect connections and channels and regional intermediaries again helped bring human lives back from captivity. In our conversation, Gershon walks us through what happened behind the scenes of the hostage negotiations, the intermediaries, the messages that were sent from him to Hamas and him to Steve Witkoff, the moments when a deal hung by a thread. He shares what it was like to engage with Hamas, literally, people who have blood on their hands, and how he still found a way to keep talking. For one simple reason: lives depended on it. We also speak about how Israel's political leadership handled these negotiations and how they were different from what was back in 2011 when Gilad Shalit was returned home. We look to the future of what the end of this war, hopefully it is over, what does that mean for prospects of getting back on track, something into the political process? Is that even possible? I urge you to listen to Gershon Baskin, who offers a rare, unvarnished look at the human side of diplomacy and the moral price of saving lives. Stay with us. Gershon Baskin, it's great to have you on the podcast. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you.
We've known each other for quite a while. I had the pleasure as the former editor, back when I was the editor of the Jerusalem Post, to edit some of your columns and to publish you on a regular basis. And I really found them, I have to say, always to be intriguing, made you question conventional thinking and what we were thought to believe, and bringing us kind of a different perspective, which was always important. But I also had the opportunity back in 2011, the night that the cabinet in Israel voted on the Gilad Shalit prisoner swap, and to remind our listeners and our viewers, back in 2011, Gilad Shalit, a soldier who had been held by Hamas for about 5 years, was finally being released in a prisoner swap that included over 1,000 prisoners that Israel was going to release. And I remember seeing you that evening, that night, at the Prime Minister's office and saying to myself, what is Gershon Baskin doing here? And obviously the story came out much later, or came out actually quickly after, of your real intense involvement in the Shalit deal, in being a go-between and a mediator, and someone who had the trust, obviously, of the Israelis and of the Palestinians. And in this case, you had connections also with Hamas. But also, once again, you played a role in the most recent prisoner swap. So I want to start with just tell us, please, if you can, Gershon, what was it again that you were involved in? How did this play out?
I've been in contact with Hamas leadership people for 18 years now, and it started before Gilad Shalit was abducted. It started before a first cousin of my wife was kidnapped and killed by Hamas in 2005, which made it all that more important for me to try to do everything to save the life of Gilad Shalit when he was abducted. And I began working on the Shalit case a week after he was abducted, when I was contacted by one of the Hamas academics that I had met at a conference in Cairo. This time around, it began, of course, after October 7th. Around the third night of the war, I heard that Israel had bombed the home of Razi Hamad, who had been my primary interlocutor in Hamas for many, many years. And I remember talking to him into the phone. I didn't know that he was in Gaza. He was actually in Beirut when we were talking. But I told him on the phone, I was, of course, horrified by what happened on October 7th. But what concerned me most in my own special abilities because of these contacts was the fact that 250 hostages had been taken, amongst them a large number of women and children. And it didn't seem, knowing Hamas, it didn't seem to me that it was logical that that was actually part of their plan. If you said they were going to kidnap soldiers, that's their plan. If they're going to kill people in Israel, that's their plan. But to abduct women and children, that's operation. And I kind of knew that logistically it was a nightmare and they would be willing to make a deal. So that's what I discussed with him on the third night of the war. He immediately made some phone calls to find out how many Palestinian women were in prison in Israel and how many minors were in prison. I found out who they are, where they're from, what they did. I found that the numbers were relatively small. If I remember correctly, it was something like 59 women and 190 minors. None of them were from Gaza. None of them were big in Hamas. None of them killed Israelis. And that seemed to me to be a deal that they would be willing to make. And I threw it out to him. I was waiting for the right moment in Israel, and the right moment came a few days later when they formed the National Emergency Government, and Gantz and Eisenkot joined the government. I sent messages to Gantz and Eisenkot telling me that Hamas was ready to make a deal for the immediate release of the women and children hostages. I tried to include the elderly and the sick as well, and the deal would be for the women prisoners and the minors. And Israel gave them the details, and I got messages back from them that they would support it in the cabinet. Unfortunately, that deal took until the end of November to happen. It should have happened at the beginning of November. I was meeting with an Egyptian intelligence officer on the morning in the beginning of November when they were supposed to receive a list of the people that Hamas was willing to release. But that was the day that Israel had surrounded the city of Gaza and Hamas froze the deal. So that was the first inkling that I got on this notion that military pressure does not release hostages, it slows down the release of hostages, and it did in that deal. After that deal was made, and I think Israel made a crucial mistake of not continuing it. I think it went for 8 days. It could have gone 9, 10, 11, 12. We could have gotten a lot more hostages home.
Although Israel will say that they stopped releasing the women and they wanted to release
Hamas
men,
breached
right?
it.
That
Hamas
was what
supposed to
happened
release
back
more
then.
women and children. They gave a list of names that didn't include just women and children. They tried to return some deceased hostages or hostages that they already killed and took their bodies. In my mind, it doesn't matter. If I were in charge, I would have said, give us whoever you're willing to give. You're 251. If we can get 100 back now, I don't care if they're women, or just bring them back, whoever we could have gotten back. But Israel was trigger happy and wanted to get back to the war. As things got deeper and more difficult, it was also at the same point, or maybe, around the same point when Ghazi Hamad had that horrible interview on Lebanese television that became infamous and viral, and he called for doing October 7th again and again and again. And I wrote him a letter cutting off connection with him. I told him, you're not worthy of talking to me. You're not the same Ghazi Hamad that I knew. Not that he was ever an angel, but he was the most pragmatic person in Hamas, and there's no doubt in my mind that Gilad Shalit is alive today because of Ghazi Hamad. He was the one in Hamas who pushed the deal and made it happen. I cut off relations with him. The following day, I'm sitting in the home of my Palestinian partner, Samer Sinjalawi, in Sheikh Jarrah, and Samer says to me, Gershon, you made a mistake. I said, what mistake? He said, you shouldn't have cut your connections with Ghazi Hamad. Maybe that connection will save human lives. I thought that was a really heavy sentence, and I thought about it a lot, and about 3 weeks later, I wrote to Ghazi Hamad saying, if talking to you can save human lives, I'm willing to renew our connection. About 3 weeks later, he wrote to me saying, okay, we stayed in contact. There wasn't much to talk about. In May of 2024, Biden presented his plan that he said Netanyahu agreed to. When I heard it, I couldn't believe that Israel and the United States, the mediators, were making efforts to do a bad deal. A 60-day ceasefire for releasing only some of the hostages with 1 million holes in it and possibilities of going back to war immediately. Just didn't make sense. At that point, it seemed to me that if we're negotiating a deal with Hamas, it should be to end the war and bring back home all the hostages. And I came out in the media and I said that, well, in July, I was contacted by some hostage families who said, could you talk to Hamas about making a better deal? I first spoke to some Israeli military folks and asked them, how long would it take Israel to withdraw from Gaza? And about 3 different military folks told me about 3 weeks. We need to withdraw entirely from Gaza. So I contacted Ghazi Hamad. Also a few other people in leadership, because I didn't want to just talk to one person. I wanted to make sure that when Ghazi Hamid told me the leadership agrees to whatever it agrees to, that there's more than him who know about it, because I've experience doing this. I said to him, what kind of deal could we work out that would end the war in 3 weeks? And Israel would withdraw from Gaza in 3 weeks. He came back to me after a few days saying he spoke to all the leadership and he proposed something, put it in writing in Arabic and in English, and it was a deal that they would return all the hostages within 2 or 3 days, the 72 hours that we have in the current deal, and the IDF would withdraw from Gaza within a period of 3 weeks, a phased withdrawal over 3 weeks. He added that Hamas would no longer govern Gaza. This was, I don't remember how many points it was, but I thought it was quite an amazing thing that they were saying. They were willing to end the war in September 2024 and release all the hostages without an immediate, before Israel withdrew from Gaza. I sent it to the Israeli negotiators. The response I got back was, the Prime Minister and the government of Israel don't agree to end the war. I responded that, to the best of my knowledge, we're not a dictatorship. There's more decision makers than the Prime Minister, there's the cabinet, there's the government, and the people of Israel are the sovereign, and the people of Israel, a majority of them, by that time had already said, let's make a deal, end the war, bring all the hostages home. Out of frustration, I sent it to the Egyptians and to the Qataris. I got a response from the Egyptians and the Qataris that they can't do anything with it unless the Americans accept it and agree to it. And I made great efforts to get it to the desk of President Biden, to the head of the CIA, and I couldn't get any traction there. And I met with 2 members of the American negotiating team at a hotel in Tel Aviv, and they told me they were so frustrated because they saw what I had brought them as a much better deal than the one that they had been working on for months since the end of May. But it didn't go anywhere, and I decided to go public. I got a phone call from retired General Amiram Levine, who I met with in Tel Aviv, and he said, Gershon, let me try. So just to make it something that he would have in his hands, he wrote the same deal up in his own words. I sent it to Ghazi Hamid, went back and forth 2 or 3 times. Ghazi Hamid said the leadership agrees to it. I have a voice message saying the leadership agrees to it. And then Amiram Levine tried to pass it through the Israeli side, very confident that he could. And of course he didn't. And after about 10 days, 2 weeks, I said to Amiram, let's go public. And he said, fine. And he said, this time let me present it. And he went on the Israeli media and said, I negotiated with Hamas this deal. It still didn't go anywhere. In December, after December...
Gershon, let me stop you for 1 second. Before we jump forward to the Trump administration for a moment, I want to ask about Ghazi Hamid for a moment. You said in the beginning that when this abduction took place on October 7th, it wasn't the MO of Hamas. You would have understood soldiers. You did not understand the women, the children, the elderly. So first, explain to us why that was out of the ordinary. And number 2 is if you can give us a little more insight into Ghazi Hamid and how you even developed a relationship with him.
Sure. Well, first, I met my first Hamas contact after working with Palestinians for more than 2 decades. I had created in 1980 a joint Israeli-Palestinian public policy think tank, and do tank as we called it. Been working with Palestinians for 2 decades. I was at a World Bank conference in Cairo where someone from the Islamic University of Gaza was there, who came to Gaza because he heard there might be some Israelis there. I was the only Israeli at this conference, and we met, spent about 6 hours talking during 2 days, agreed on very little. But I proposed to him to create some kind of dialogue between Israelis and members of Hamas from the academic community, and he agreed to that. In the end, it never happened because the Hamas leadership vetoed it. But it brought me to Gaza, to the Islamic University. I met him and his colleagues, and he and I got in the car and drove to the Prime Minister's office and spent 2 hours with one of the advisors of Ismail Haniyeh, who had actually said at the end of 2 hours that he would join our dialogue group. But again, it didn't happen because Khalid Mashal and others in Damascus vetoed it. A week after Gilad Shalit was abducted, the professor called me and said, Gershon, we have to do something. I said, what can we do? He said, let's open up a channel of communication. And he went to the Prime Minister's office, and the Prime Minister's office called me, the Hamas Prime Minister's office. The Director General called me, told me that someone else would be calling me. Half an hour later, Ghazi Hamad called me. He presented himself as Dr. Ghazi Hamad, the spokesperson of the Hamas government and advisor to Ismail Haniyeh. He spoke to me in Hebrew, which I felt uncomfortable with, and I told him, you can speak to me in Arabic or in English if you want. He said, no, I like to speak Hebrew. That kind of shocked me. He learned Hebrew in prison, of course. And then he had suggested, let's try and arrange a phone call between the father of the soldier, as he called him, and one of the Hamas leaders. I'm actually sitting in my kitchen looking at my two pre-army aged boys at the time, thinking if I were the soldier's father who was kidnapped in Gaza, this is really unusual. This is not what I expected. You know, the Hamas guy is proposing a phone call with the father of the soldier that they're holding, that they abducted. Later in the day, I arranged that phone call between Noam Shalit. It actually took place with Ghazi Hamad. The next day, the Shalit family came to Jerusalem. I met them for the first time, and I told them that I would be with them until Gilad Shalit comes home. It took me 2.5 months to produce a sign of life from Gilad Shalit. It was a handwritten letter that was delivered to the Egyptians in Gaza. It took me another trip to Gaza to meet Ghazi Hamad to propose the handwritten letter, because we were working on them delivering a videotape, but they wanted 350 women and minors prisoners released from Israel, and Olmert wouldn't agree to that. And we even negotiated them down to 51 busload that would go to Ramallah to Mahmoud Abbas, and Olmert wouldn't agree to that. By the way, I was transferring messages to Olmert through his daughter Dana. That was a way of escaping the whole system and getting directly to Olmert. 50 days after Gilad was abducted, Olmert appointed someone to be a coordinator of the missing in action and hostages. And that was Ofer Dekel, former deputy head of the Shin Bet, and I made contact on the day that he was appointed, and we met and spoke. Anyway, that was how my contact started with Ghazi Hamad. He was the primary interlocutor for the 5 years and 4 months that Gilad Shalit was in captivity. There were other Hamas members that I met and had contact with, but he had served in the position for 1.5 years of being the liaison between the political and military wings of Hamas. And he became very close to Ahmed Jabri, who was the head of the Hamas military wing, the guy who actually built Hamas into a military machine. And Ghazi had a very good relationship with Ahmed Jabri, and he proved to be the most effective channel of getting through to the people who were holding Gilad Shalit. So we kept those contacts going throughout the time that Gilad Shalit was in captivity. In 2014, I was approached by members of the Mengistu family, who told me that their relative Avera Mengistu had gone into Gaza, and no one in Israel knew about
An
it.
Ethiopian Israeli. Right.
Ethiopian Israeli. They were told by the Israeli establishment not to talk about it, not to make any noise, not to let anyone know, that it would raise the price, and the whole story that we know. But after months that nothing was being done to release Mengistu, they contacted me and asked me to see if I could do anything. And I made contact with Ghazi Hamad again and some other people and started working on that case. Then the war in Gaza in 2014 happened, and 2 Israeli soldiers were killed in Gaza, and their remains were left in Gaza, Oron Shaul and Hadar Golden. And I started talking to Hamas about their release. And then we learned about a Bedouin Israeli who was also alive in Gaza named Hisham Asayed. Now, Hisham and Avera were both people who suffered from severe mental illness, diagnosed schizophrenics, on medication, all kinds of things like that. I made contact, and with Hamas, I sent medical records of Avera Mengistu. I talked to them about the bodies. A guy named Lior Lotan was in charge of the file at that point. I made contact with Lior Lotan. I sat with him once every couple of months, told him what I was trying to do, told me what the system was willing to do. And by that time, the Israeli system was not ready to release a single prisoner who was serving life sentence in exchange for the bodies of the 2 Israelis and for the 2 civilians. I worked on it intensively and got nowhere. Lior Lotan resigned. He was replaced by Yaron Blum. Yaron Blum had been on the team of David Meidan. I already knew him from before. Started working through Yaron Blum to do anything. Basically, all those years, 8 years I think I worked on that. There was nowhere to go because the Israeli side wasn't willing to make a deal that wouldn't release prisoners that had killed Israelis, and Hamas was not willing to make a deal where they didn't get prisoners who killed Israelis. So it was a dead end. Yaron Blum ended up resigning after, 5 years, 6 years. The file went over to the Prime Minister's military attaché, Avi Gil. I contacted Avi Gil. I sat with him in the Prime Minister's office, told him what I was doing, told him what I
I mean,
thought
and
was
just, but
right.
Gershon, sorry to cut you off, but to really stress this point, you're doing this. No one's asking you to. You're doing
No,
this
no one's asked
because
me
you
to.
feel the need to. Right.
Yes. I feel that I have the need to. One, because I'm probably the only Israeli in this country who has any connections with Hamas. I'm probably spent more hours talking to Hamas and meeting Hamas people than anyone else in the country, except for people from the Israeli Prison Authority, and that's a whole different conversation that they have. So I'm in a unique position, and I'm well known. I have a track record. You know, when I first met David Maidan in May of 2011, he asked me, "What do you want for this?" And I looked at him
He
and
was the media. He was the hostage negotiator who ended up bringing the deal, the
right,
Shalit deal
he
in
was the active
2011. Right.
Mossad senior
Right.
officer, the first one who was actually an active Mossad officer. He said, "What do you want?" And I looked at him like I honestly didn't know what he was asking me. What do you mean? What do you want? He said to me, "You want money? You want what do you want?" I said, "Nothing." He said, "Nothing?" I said, "You know, David, there's one thing I want. When Gilad Shalit crosses the border, I want to be there." That was the one thing I asked for. On the morning that Gilad Shalit came home, David Maidan called me in the morning before 7 o'clock in the morning. He told me, "Gershon, I tried. Netanyahu won't allow it. Netanyahu wouldn't let me be at the border." That was the only thing I asked for. Anyway, all these years, you know, if they offered me money for doing this, I wouldn't take it. This is not something I'm doing for profit. This is something that I think is my civil duty as a citizen of this country, who's loyal to this country, who thinks that we're in a very, very bad situation politically because there's someone in this country who decided that Hamas is an asset and the Palestinian Authority is a liability. I say that noting that after Gilad Shalit was home and there was no longer the argument that we can't do anything with the Palestinians because an Israeli soldier is held hostage in Gaza, that I tried to duplicate the model of the secret direct back channel with David Maidan and Mahmoud Abbas. And in 2012, 2013, 3 times I brought offers from Mahmoud Abbas to conduct direct secret negotiations with Netanyahu through David Maidan and myself. And Netanyahu refused. He simply refused, wasn't interested.
Take us now to
Yeah.
December.
So first Trump is elected. In December, he announces that he's appointing Steve Witkoff as his Middle East envoy. I never heard of the guy, didn't know anything about him, didn't know what he was. Samer, my partner, had gotten an invitation to a Bitcoin conference in Abu Dhabi, and he saw that Witkoff was going to be one of the keynote speakers. So Samer said, "Let's go and try to meet him." So we bought tickets and signed up for the conference and looked for Witkoff and discovered when we were at the conference that he was in a separate part of the conference that was for the high spenders. It cost $10,000 to get into the room where he was speaking. So we waited outside the room, waiting for him. We saw he got up from his seat and went to the men's room. We followed him and waited for him outside the men's room. When he came out, we trapped him. So we got him as he was coming out of the men's room, introduced ourselves, handed him business cards. We gave him an article that Samerson Jalawi and I had published together. Told him in a few sentences who we are. I now had his WhatsApp number and I started communicating with him. I started sending him information more about who I was and what I had done, about the Shalit deal. I told him about the deal that I had reached with Hamas in September, sent him a copy of it. My bottom line message to him all the time was that the only way this war will end is when President Trump decides to end it. That from everything that we know, Prime Minister Netanyahu wants to keep this war going. His primary objective is to stay in power, and keeping the war going keeps him in power. That was my message. I was honest, upfront, transparent about all my messages. I told him the people that I was in contact with Hamas, my ability to contact Hamas, and I told him I could be useful if you decide to use me. About 2.5 months ago, he started engaging me in a much more two-way communication. And at that point, I told him that I would deliver his messages directly to the Hamas leadership. They would get to the Hamas leadership. He would get answers back from them quickly, much more quickly than going through the Qataris and the Egyptians at that time. He was working almost exclusively through the Qataris. He's very good friends of the Qatari Prime Minister and someone in the Prime Minister's office and the Emir, and he trusted them very much. I told him that I actually was in Qatar October, the Qataris had invited me for me to tell them about the September deal. So I had met some of these people as well. But there I was, copying and pasting messages from Witkoff to Hamas, from Hamas to Witkoff. I utilized all that communication to always throw out ideas on how to get to a deal. There was a major disagreement between me and Witkoff, which we discussed over and over again, and that was the Americans believed, and say the Americans, this is Trump and Witkoff and probably Kushner, that the Israeli military pressure would bring Hamas to surrender.
And well, that's the Israeli narrative. That's definitely the Netanyahu narrative.
I kept telling Witkoff, what I've said on the Israeli media for years is that Hamas will never surrender. It's not part of their DNA. Hamas told me during this war, they're willing to fight to the last Gazan. They will not surrender to Israel. It's not part of who they are and what they do. And Witkoff would give me all kinds of other examples. World War II, the Japanese, the Nazis, if you want Hezbollah. And I told them that these are all good examples, but they're not Hamas. Hamas will not surrender. I think that remains a difference of opinion between me and him until today. But around the beginning
what was it, Gershon, in the end, that brought this deal together? Because Netanyahu will tell you, well, it was the fact that I launched the Gaza City offensive, what's known as Gideon's Chariots number 2, and I was willing to go in.
How it fell into place. In the beginning of September, I proposed to Ghazi Hamid that we do what we did in the Shalit deal. After months of going back and forth on a paper, it went through 6 versions, 6 iterations that I felt like we were just wasting time. It was like a ping pong ball going back and forth. I said to Ghazi, let's try and produce a document. And Ghazi said, okay, I'll write something. And I thought that was really good. When he takes the initiative to write something, he came back to me with a document. I showed it to Witkoff. Witkoff said some things about it. I told Ghazi what Witkoff's, by the way, Witkoff told me all the time, never say his name. Say the Americans. So it's the Americans or the guy in Washington. I had all kinds of, but I never used his name. Witkoff said, if I see my name written in an Israeli intelligence report that I'm having direct contact with Hamas, this channel is dead. So first of all, I went silent. I wasn't giving any interviews and I didn't use his name in any of the interactions. But the paper that we wrote after going back and forth and Witkoff approving it became known as the eight-point proposal, which is a proposal to end the war, release all the hostages within 72 hours, and a gradual Israeli withdrawal over time while there's going to be a new Palestinian government, a Palestinian police force in Gaza. The idea of the multinational force came later after Doha, and I'll mention that in a moment. And Ghazi Hamid told me now they need to receive this 8-point document from the Qataris. So Witkoff said, okay, I'm delivering it to the Qataris, they'll give it to Hamas. And then Hamas has a meeting with the Qataris, and they ask to see the document, and they're given a 5-point document that looks to them like the 5 demands of Netanyahu to end the war. And the Hamas people ask the Qataris, where's the 8-point document that we know about? And the Qataris pull out the document and say, these are American ideas, but we want you to agree to this 5-point document. So Ghazi Hamid contacts me and says, what's going on? The Qataris said that this 5-point document, this is Netanyahu's demands, we can't agree to that. I contact Witkoff. He's sitting at the tennis tournament, sitting next to the president, and I'm watching him on CNN on television, WhatsApping me.
Wow.
And he tells me, tell Hamas to agree to the 8 points, and I'll bring the Israelis. I tell this to Ghazi Hamid. They go back to the Qataris, and the Qataris say, no, the document is the 5 points. This is the one you need to agree to. So I tell Witkoff, you got to straighten this out. On September 8th in the evening, at about 10:20, he calls me and tells me the Qataris are now sitting with the Hamas delegation, giving them the last and final version of our proposal. I'm not giving it to you because we don't want any leaks, but it contains the 8 points. And Hamas will be discussing it over the 7 days. He asked me to put pressure on Hamas to say yes. He said to me, they can't say no. There's no way they can say no to this. This gives them what they need. It gives Israel what it needs. It's going to end the war and bring the hostages home. Make sure they say yes. And the next day, Israel tried to kill them all.
Right.
Now, when it happened, I immediately got on the phone to Witkoff. I told him, Steve, there's not a person in the region who doesn't think that Trump didn't give a green light for Netanyahu to do this. Israel wouldn't do this without a green light from Trump. And he gets back to me and says, tell everyone we didn't do it. We didn't know about it. We had nothing to do about it. We condemn it. We don't like it. He said, tell everyone to look at Trump's Truth Social. It's going to be there officially. Trump is going to put in an announcement removing himself from this. The next day, I can't reach anyone in Hamas. I don't know who's alive, who's dead. We don't know. The Israelis are all saying it was a successful mission. We killed the whole Hamas leadership. I'm thinking to myself, knowing Hamas, that if God forbid they killed all the Hamas leadership, the Hamas people in Gaza are going to execute all the hostages. None of the hostages, living hostages, are going to make it out alive if Israel had killed the whole Hamas leadership in Gaza. As opposed to what everyone in Israel was saying, including Shin Bet and Shabak people and Mossad people, that this is going to free the hostages. I knew 100% this was going to kill the hostages. So I was really in shock. The next day, I get a WhatsApp message from someone else in the Hamas leadership who tells me we're all alive. They didn't kill any of us. We've been instructed by the Qataris to not go outside and not to use our phones. So you're not going to hear from us. I wrote him in the message, are you still willing to make a deal to end the war? And he said, the only thing that we want is to end the war. And that was it. And then I didn't hear from him. I kept sending messages to 8 different Hamas leaders over the next week. I saw that from time to time they would open it and see the messages, some of it. After about 5 or 6 days, Razi Hamid contacted me and said, you told us for months that we have to negotiate with the Americans, which is true. I kept telling them, every idea that I threw out to Hamas for months, they would tell me, Israel will never agree to that. Israel won't agree to that. And I kept telling them, you're not negotiating with Israel. Israel won't agree to anything. You have to imagine that you're sitting in the room across from Donald Trump. If you convince Donald Trump, you bring in Israel. There's no way to directly get Israel to agree. That was my message. And then Razi Hamid tells me, Trump tried to kill us. How can we believe the Americans? My response to him is that you have no one else. Whether you trust him or not, Trump is the only person in the world who can end this war. So you need to make a deal with Trump. What he said then is that, before in the 8-point agreement, what we were talking about, what Witkoff was talking about, was a side letter from the president guaranteeing that when they release the hostages, Israel will not renew the war. And to back that out, Witkoff had gotten a green light from Trump to meet with Hamas directly. And
I want to ask you about that, because until now, and you had mentioned that Witkoff threatened, basically, if this gets out, that I'm talking to Hamas through you, a mediator, that will have repercussions. But we actually heard Witkoff on 60 Minutes this week say how he went to meet with Khalil al-Chaya, the leader of Hamas, based in Doha, but the leader of Hamas in Gaza, whose son was killed in that strike in Doha, and even shared his own story of losing his own son, and the solidarity or the sympathy as two fathers who lost children. Jared Kushner said how that helped create those lines, make it more human than just political or security. So in the end, the Americans met with Hamas. I mean, that's a big deal.
Yeah, not only that, before September 9th, the strike in Doha, Witkoff had gotten permission from Trump to sit in the same room and negotiate with Hamas. And we were actually trying to organize a meeting that would take place in Istanbul to bring them there on the 8 points or the latest version of the document, whatever it is. When the 8-point document was there, Witkoff wanted to meet them face to face in Istanbul, together with the Egyptians and the Qataris. And we were trying to organize that. After September 9th, that was not going to happen. But before the Sharm el-Sheikh deal happened, they met face to face with Khalil al-Chaya. What Israelis also don't know is that when they initialed the agreement at 2 o'clock in the morning, the Hamas, 4 people from the Hamas delegation were sitting in the room across the table from the Israeli delegation with the Qataris, the Turks, and the Egyptians in the same room. So that wasn't shown.
No, those pictures did come out, but the Israeli media was trying to downplay the significance of it. I mean,
they censored it because when they showed the room, they showed 3 sides of the table and not the 4th side of the table. But some of the Arab networks had done the same thing in reverse. They showed the Arabs without showing the Israelis. And when they showed the Arabs, they showed the 4 members of the Hamas delegation.
Gershon, you've been dealing with this for a long time. I mean, there's an issue here, I think, which is much bigger to some extent. I'm curious what you think. Obviously, Israel still is hoping to get back the remaining bodies, but getting back the living hostages is obviously was the priority, and that has been achieved. How do we prevent this from happening again? I mean, we get into these cycles, and you've now been involved in these negotiations for pretty much 20 years. 20
I've been
years.
involved in Israeli-Palestinian negotiations since
No,
1988.
the negotiations on the bigger level. I'm not even asking you how do we get to a
No,
resolution.
because the answer to your question is in the question itself. What I note is this, a lot of the people in the international media, when they talk to me, they talk about the peace deal that was made. And Trump
Right.
talks about the peace deal. And even Witkoff in a
This
message
is
to
no
me
peace
this
deal.
morning,
Right.
Witkoff in a message to me this morning wrote, we're pushing the peace deal forward. There's not peace. This is an end of the war. It's a ceasefire. And it's a unique end of the war because wars usually end with the end of the conflict. But nothing has changed in the conflict. The conflict is alive and kicking. It's still there. I was in Ramallah the other day. I gave an interview on the Saudi Al Arabiya channel, did a podcast like this in Ramallah. And I haven't been in Ramallah in the last 2 years since the war began. And one of the most amazing things, you look at Ramallah, or you look at I was in Bet Sahor a couple of weeks ago, you look at any of these Palestinian cities or towns in the West Bank where the situation is horrible. The economy is wrecked. People are unemployed. They don't have money. 1,000 Palestinians have been killed in the past 2 years. 100 new settlements and outposts have been created by Smutrich over the last 2 years. People are really suffering, but it's quiet. And I ask myself, why is it quiet? And the reason is because every single person in the West Bank looks at Gaza and says, I don't want Gaza here. What Israel did in Gaza, they can do in the West Bank too. I don't want that to happen. So Israel has created a real kind of deterrence that it didn't have before. There are still acts of terrorism and there's still cells and individuals, but there's no
So
Hamas.
this is the moment to actually engage in a political process from a
It,
point of
it
strength then.
would be if we had different leadership. We don't. We have a government in Israel which will never reach out and make peace with the Palestinians. So we have a Palestinian leader in Mahmoud Abbas, who's 90 years old in the 20th year of a 4-year term, enjoying zero legitimacy on the streets of Palestine, and
But
thus
yeah,
has never had the political courage to make a deal. 2.5 years ago, 3 years ago, I brought Mahmoud Abbas and Ehud Olmert together and I suggested to Olmert, Ehud, what do you think about us trying to close the gaps that existed between you and Abu Mazen back in 2008, 2009? He said, go for it. It took me 3 months to convince Mahmoud Abbas to go for it. And when he did, 2 of his people came to Olmert's office and we carried on a negotiation. And in August of 2023, we reached an agreement and Mahmoud Abbas was in Amman and he says to Olmert, come and we'll sign it in Amman. And 10 minutes before Olmert and I boarded the plane, I get a phone call telling him not to come. Why? Because the Jordanians didn't know that the former prime minister was coming and they didn't make the arrangements. But that was not true because Olmert travels with the security detail and the security detail made all the arrangements. After that, the following day, Abbas's office says, tell Olmert to come to Ramallah to discuss the paper. Olmert says, I've been there before. I'll go to sign the paper. I'm not going to discuss it. We agreed already. Abbas didn't have the courage to do it. Instead, we ended up bringing Nasser al-Kidwa, the former Palestinian foreign minister, the nephew of Yasser Arafat, the PLO representative in the UN for 17 years. He had never met Olmert. Olmert never met him. And Samer Sinjalawi and I carried on negotiations between Olmert and Nasser over Zoom. Nasser said, I won't sign a paper that Abu Mazen didn't sign. I said to Nasser, you write something. And on the basis of what he wrote, Olmert and Nasser signed this vision paper. And although neither of these two men are in power, the fact that 2 people can come together during a war and paint a vision for the future, we thought was significant. And it got a lot of traction around the world, and I don't know where it's going to go.
Gershon,
Nasser,
I think,
just one more
yeah.
sentence just about Nasser, because Nasser had an opportunity to meet with the foreign ministers of the European Union, and I was sitting next to the Dutch foreign minister, used to be ambassador here, he's a friend, and he says to me, what should I ask Nasser? And I said, ask Nasser, if you're appointed by Abbas to head the temporary technocratic government in Gaza, will you do it? And he asked the question, and Nasser said, you got to be crazy to want to take that job. But if I'm asked, I will do it because that's my responsibility as a Palestinian leader.
What I find to be, I mean, first of all, I think it's really the commitment is incredible. And what I find to be amusing to some extent is how Israelis, definitely those on the right, looked at Trump in his first term. And we all remember when Netanyahu went to Washington in 2019, for the rollout of the Trump so-called peace plan, the peace to prosperity, the leaders of the Judean Samaria communities of the settlements came with and thought that they were going to get annexation. It didn't happen then. When they thought now in this Trump administration, they would also get annexation, and instead they get a Trump administration that back then in 2019, his plan called for a Palestinian state. And in the 20-point plan, right, that eventually came out, he also calls for a Palestinian state. So
Not
Donald
directly.
Trump,
It's the first time, though, that Trump and his people are talking about Palestinian rights. They never spoke about Palestinian rights before. The Palestinian state hasn't yet appeared.
so where do we go then? Because the administration, I mean, there seems to be, look, we know there's the huge divide between Israel, us, and the Palestinians, obviously. Hamas, not much to talk about. But we also know that the Americans are viewing this very differently than the current government in Jerusalem.
Yeah.
How do we move forward?
Well, first of all, it's important to note that the Americans, Trump, Witkoff, and Kushner told Netanyahu annexation is off the table and ethnic cleansing is off the table. He's also said to them that Gaza will be built for the Gazans. The Gaza Riviera is off the table. So the current Trump administration is completely focused on something else. I sent to Witkoff this morning, he was on the plane about to land in Israel. He sent me a note, we're going to be landing. I told him we have two big ideas to present to you. And I actually didn't want to present them now because they're really for later. And he said, what are they? And I sent him two big ideas that I think is the next thing they can do after they settle everything to do with ending this war, making it stable, getting the Palestinian government, Palestinian police force, the multinational force on the ground. Two big ideas that could change history and put Trump really in the place where he's going to advance the Middle East peace. But Witkoff responded, we're only focused right now on stabilizing the ceasefire and moving into phase two. So we'll deal with that later. I think that in order for this to happen, we don't just need the American president who's going to support it. We really do need to go to elections in Israel, and the Palestinians need to go to elections. And in terms of sequencing, if the Palestinians were to go to elections first for president and for their parliament, and they can call it elections for the government of the state of Palestine, it doesn't really matter. Mahmoud Abbas obligated himself in his letter to Mohammed bin Salman and to Emmanuel Macron and to the New York conference that supported the two-state solution with 141 countries signing in, that the Palestinian election law would only let political parties run that agree to the PLO political line, which means two states. That's not a good way of putting it if I were them, and I advise them to say that any political party that supports the armed struggle is not allowed to participate. But it doesn't matter, it means the same thing. If the Palestinians were to elect Palestinian leaders who stood up and said, this conflict needs to end, we are ready to make peace with the state of Israel, we recognize the Jewish people's connection to the land of Israel, how can we as Muslims not recognize that? It's in our Holy Quran, and make up for some of the mistakes they've made in the past. I think that would have a deep impact on the Israeli electorate. I don't know if the sequencing is going to happen, but I can't imagine a situation when we do eventually go to elections that the Israeli public will forget October 7th. That the Israeli public will forget that Israel failed to protect itself on October 7th, and Benjamin Netanyahu was our prime minister. That he ran an administration that had Hamas funded, that his administration saw Hamas as an asset in the Palestinian Authority as a library. It's just bewildering to me to imagine the reality of Israel that forgets all of that.
And I think it's also, but I think there's something even bigger here, and I totally agree on that sense. In the question of accountability, I mean, I co-authored a book all about how this October 7th happened, and everything you said about the funding and the liability and the asset, 100% part of it. But I also think it's time for Israel to grow up and make decisions of where it wants to go, and that's the bigger issue here. Is for too long, we've just fallen in love with the so-called status quo. It's not sustainable, and we have to decide where we want to go long term.
And what I've been saying since the beginning of the war, really from the beginning of the war, I've written over and over again, at the end of the war, we're going to wake up to the reality of 7 million Israeli Jews and 7 million Palestinian Arabs living between the river and the sea. And we can't keep doing this. We've been killing
Yeah.
each other for 100 years. We can't keep doing it. This has to be the last war. So I really believe that there's a chance that there will be this awakening of the Israeli public and the Palestinian publics. I know in Gaza, while they blame Israel for all their suffering and death and destruction, they hold Hamas responsible. No one in Gaza wants to see Hamas anymore. I know that this is happening now in the West Bank too. It's slower in the West Bank because they haven't spent 20 years living under Hamas, and Hamas heroized the whole conflict. But I think that every Palestinian who heard Khalil Chaya making his speech about how they won the war, people look around and say,
Yeah.
this is victory? What kind of victory is this? So I
Well,
think that we are in for change. We have to make the change happen. We have to make sure that our political leaders who we do elect in the future are open-minded more than the current leaders that we have. And if we have a Trump administration pushing in that direction, which I hope we will, we could actually change everything.
Gershon Baskin, let me thank you for just everything you've done. And like I said, and like I opened, I saw you there that night back in 2011. So to anyone who questions this version of events, I know that I can at least testify it's real. And Gershon has long been involved in all of this behind the scenes. So let me just thank you for helping to make this possible. There's 20 people and 20 families and an entire country that has now is finally be able to start to heal largely due to the contribution that you made. And to all our viewers and
Yaakov,
listeners,
and
yes,
Yaakov, we have to continue to do everything possible to get the deceased hostages home as well. And I'm doing that and pushing every single day. And some of the families have asked me if I can reach out to Hamas if they know anything. I don't expect to get answers, but I do it. Every time a hostage family asks me to convey a message to Hamas, I do. I usually don't get any responses, but I will continue to do that and continue to make sure that Hamas is doing, to the best of my ability, through the Qataris and the Egyptians and the Turks and Witkoff and Kushner, that they do. I don't believe that they will be able to find everyone in the end.
yeah,
And that's a very sad reality, but they need to do everything possible to find them.
we do. We do. Thank you, Gershon, and thank you to all our viewers and listeners. Thanks for following us on Apple, Spotify, YouTube, and where podcasts can be found. And Gershon, thank you very much once again.